Hello, 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 everyone, and good morning, good evening, and good afternoon from wherever you're tuning in from. Can you guys hear me okay? I always like to start off with that before I start chatting. Anybody in the chat, if you're there, let me know if you can hear me loud and clear. See, I think people are just filling in. Perfect. Thank you, guys. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So we are very excited today for this webinar. I know that those of you in the audience, some of you we have spoken to before, so welcome and thank you for coming here. To those who have worked with us and spoken to us before, if you're just joining us for the first time, welcome. My name is Danny Gold. I'm an account executive here at Montrium, and with me is my partner in crime, Jana De Robertis, who is our head of compliance here at Montrium. We talk all things Adobe Part 11, and we have a wonderful webinar here for you today. But without further ado, I'm going to just get into the agenda and some housekeeping for us today, and then I'm going to pass it over to Jana so that you guys can get to the meat and potatoes of today's webinar. And yes, Frederick, do not worry. I am about to answer all of these questions in our little housekeeping. I will let you guys know when it'll all be available. So first things first, so the agenda today. So we're going to be using Adobe Sign as a case study, and we are going to examine the concepts of computerized system validation, the risk proportionate validation planning, risk management through effective governance, supplier management, assessing the cloud service provider, and change management strategies for maintaining the validated state. And so this recording will be available after the session. Usually, because of the Goldcast platform, it gives us a couple days before we actually have the full recording to post. So it'll be available next week, most likely. But you all be getting an email from me, just like you've been getting before, with a follow-up after this webinar that will let you know where you can download the session. So the presentation is also already available for download on the right side. It's the Docs tab right there next to the Messages and the QA tab. And then later in the webinar, we're going to be answering some questions. We have some that we have picked out already that you have sent in, but please feel free to put your questions there. If any pop up and we have time at the end to answer, we'd be more than happy to answer them. But that is enough from me. I'm going to hand it over to Jana. Jana, you can take it away.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I've been working here at Montrium for a very long time, always in a role that is attached to quality and to validation. The purpose of today's webinar is really just to reflect on many years of working in computerized system validation and to discuss current insights and new perspectives on validating cloud-based solutions for 21 CFR Part 11 compliance. For the last few years, Montrium's been working very closely with Adobe. We've helped many organizations validate their electronic signature solution. And so it's only natural that today we chose to use Adobe Acrobat Sign to help us illustrate the concepts that we'll be discussing and sharing in today's webinar. So here at Montrium, we work with health and life science organizations on a daily basis. We work with pharmaceutical companies, hospitals, universities, and other types of institutions who turn to us for guidance and for assistance on 21 CFR Part 11. And after so many years of doing this, we're kind of amazed at how mystified people still are with validation. So, one of the questions we get quite often is, why do we even need to validate the system? And it's it's a very basic and elementary question, but the answer is quite simple. It starts with the regulations. That's where it starts. Validation of a computerized system is a regulatory requirement. So we can't really fight with that. You'll see on the screen that there are some examples of from the industry's regulations and from guidance documents. And these clearly stipulate that the computerized system needs to be validated. The reason why you need to validate is because you, as a user of the system, need to be confident that the system is reliable and that it can be used to generate accurate and trustworthy electronic records and electronic signatures. Data integrity is really important. So you need to also, trust that system, and you need to be confident that the system is suitable for your intended use. But since every organization is going to use a system in their own unique way to fit into the context of their own business process, it actually falls on the responsibility of each organization to make sure that the chosen solution is appropriate for their intended use. I want to emphasize that it's the responsibility of the user or the organization using the system to do the validation. It's not the vendor who will validate the system. The vendor will provide you with the system. They'll do their best to make sure that the delivered solution works properly, but it's the regulated user who is responsible for compliance and for making sure that the system is fit for their intended use. Now, the regulations are going to tell you that you need to validate the system, but they're not actually going to tell you how to do it. And that leaves many of us confused about what actually needs to be done. With the traditional or old-fashioned way, computerized system validation, or CSV, would follow a standard V-model approach. GAMP5, which is an industry best practice guide, defines computerized system validation as achieving and maintaining compliance with applicable GXP regulations and fitness for intended use. By this definition, CSV puts the emphasis on meeting the applicable regulations. And this often translates into the mindset where validation is something that we do basically because we need to pass an audit or an inspection, which is not really the right mindset to be in. The side effect of that is that the traditional CSV model is going to be a process that is very documentation heavy, resource intensive, and it represents a heavy workload with, let's be honest, is not very exciting at all. So recently there's been a shift towards CSA, which is computer software assurance. And as defined in the FDA guidance document, which is still in draft, CSA is a risk-based approach for establishing and maintaining confidence that software is fit for intended use. So there you can see again, those words come up again, fit for intended use. There's nothing new or groundbreaking there. Whether it's CSV or CSA, that's where the focus is. But with CSA, things are being shaken up. CSA is favoring the use of critical thinking to come up with an appropriate and justified approach towards making sure that your system is fit for intended use. And by using different techniques, you can actually reduce the documentation burden without compromising on overall quality. With CSA, the emphasis is on quality, not so much on the applicable regulations. But since the quality is baked into regulations, it's rolled into and embedded straight into that regulatory requirements. Ensuring quality will naturally lead to compliance anyway. So the common thread between CSA and CSV is that you need to perform a set of activities to make sure that the processes, your GXP processes, meet regulatory standards for quality, patient safety, and data integrity. Whether you call it CSV or call it CSA, in the end, it really is just validation. Whatever you choose to call it, your validation project should always begin with proper validation planning. After all, failing to prepare is preparing to fail. Did I say that correctly? Yeah. Failing to prepare is preparing to fail. It's not my quote, but I like it. Thoughtful planning will lead to a suitable and scalable approach that will help you ensure your system is fit for intended use. When you're planning your validation project, you should rely on informed decision-making and good judgment to develop an appropriate approach. The approach needs to be risk proportionate, and you should adapt it to your system. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation. So take some time to consider risk. What aspects of the system are critical to patient safety, patient rights, the quality, and the data integrity? Is there any functionality that can compromise these risk areas? Think about, should the system fail to work as intended, would there be any risks? And if you identify any functionality that can introduce risk, then those areas would merit more attention during your validation project. You should also scale your validation activities according to system complexity. If your system is a custom developed solution, or if it's complex because of how, if it's underlying architecture, or because it's designed with many different components, then probably there's a greater chance that there will be failures with your system. A simple system is certainly going to be easier to operate and probably will have less chance of failure. So when you're thinking about system complexity, the more complicated your system is, the more work you would probably need to do to ensure that it's working consistently and behaving as intended. The other thing is you should not overlook supplier capability. The software developer or the supplier of the system is very knowledgeable in how the system works. So take a look at their lifecycle activities and consider the work that they've already done. If they can instill confidence in you, the more confidence you have in your supplier, the less work you'll probably need to do. Your validation approach should consider all these factors and be defined in writing. Describe it and describe also what your approach will be by explaining your intent to minimize risks and to leverage any documentation that is available from your supplier. Overall, when you're following the risk-based approach, you'll end up with an appropriate strategy that generates the appropriate level of documentation with the appropriate level of detail in this documentation. Remember that the level of compliance that you achieve is not proportional to the amount of paperwork you produce. More documents is not necessarily a good thing, but working smart and intelligently is a good thing. So take that time to do the critical thinking. So once you've come up with your plan, you've secured your resources to do the project, and you're ready to get started. But what's your actual next step for validation? Well, if we go back to that definition, your goal here is to ensure the system is fit for intended use. So who defines what the intended use is? That would be you as the regulated user. You're responsible for defining and demonstrating the fitness for intended use. So what you need to do is bring in the proper stakeholders. Talk to your subject matter experts, talk to the business process owners, and gather a solid understanding of how the system will be used within the context of your business, and find out, from them, let them help you understand and define what your intended use is. From there, your next step is to actually verbalize that. And usually we do that by defining our requirements, spelling out our requirements. And when you do that, consider and reflect on the outcome of your risk assessments, and make sure that your requirements do reflect regulatory requirements, functional requirements, and governance requirements too. From there, you have an understanding of what you need and what you expect from the system. So your next step is to actually go and create the system. I'm using the term create as a very generic verb, but what it means is that as the regulated user, you should proceed with installing, implementing, deploying, configuring, doing whatever it is to make sure that you build out the system with the required system or technical controls. As you do this, you'll find that you may need to enable and sometimes disable system features. These are, in accordance to what you need to meet your system requirements, and the requirements that you defined as part of your intended use. So for example, you're going to need a system generated audit trail, but was that turned on by default, or do you need to take action to make sure it's available? You may also need to enable or disable certain features to mitigate risks that you identified during your validation planning. So an example of this would be, for example, you have a risk of unauthorized system access, and you might work around that by making sure that multi-factor authentication is turned on. When we speak of Acrobat Sign, you may want to, you will want to, you will need to ensure that your instance is configured with the biopharma settings. And this is to ensure that the electronic signature manifestation has all the required elements for a Part 11 compliance signature, and also to ensure that users are authenticated at the right moment in time in the workflow at the time of signing. So great, you have your system in hand. What's your next step, right? Your task isn't to build out the system. Your task is to make sure that it's fit for intended use. And you should do this before you actually make the system available for operational use. So while it's not the only activity that you need to do, the main activity for ensuring your requirements have been met is through testing. Testing should be performed to demonstrate the effectiveness of the technical controls that have been built into the system. But testing can come in many different shapes and forms. Don't be afraid to explore the different methodologies These are all in line, very much in line with the current CSA thinking. So first of all, think about the testing that your vendor has already done. Your software developer, they follow a software development lifecycle. And in itself, this includes software testing activities. If your vendor makes their test documentation available for you to review and assess, then there's a great opportunity to leverage those activities as a way of reducing the burden of testing on your side. If the vendor shares with you any documentation that provides you with confidence that the system is working properly and as intended, then consider leveraging that documentation instead of duplicating the testing effort on your end. It's kind of a wasted effort because the results are already available. So when you leverage the vendor supply documentation, it will save you a lot of time and effort. The use of unscripted testing is also a very acceptable approach, and it's actually encouraged, especially with lower risk functions. Unscripted testing can include ad hoc testing, exploratory testing, or just simple testing in the context of the normal business process, as it would be carried out in the day-to-day activities of a typical user. Unscripted testing doesn't mean undocumented testing. Don't make that mistake. Records of testing and test results still need to be captured and traceable to the requirements, even if it's unscripted. What unscripted means is that less detailed information will be captured. You don't necessarily have to have all the step-by-step instructions written down. And in fact, that's where the value is, because it will give the tester a little bit more freedom and liberty to just dive into the system and explore and search for defects. The benefit of this is that it actually allows you to extend your test coverage, right? Because the time that you would have otherwise spent writing out your test plans and the test step instructions is now freed up for you to reallocate to actually just dive into the system and actually test the system. So in the end, you're actually improving your ability to detect the defects, to fix the defects, and in the end, you'll increase quality. So that's a good thing. Scripted testing is more formal. It's dependent on detailed test cases that provide written step-by-step instructions. But this is more time-consuming and even more costly because you need to assign resources to that to be able to write out the test instructions. Those scripted test instructions, they can be performed manually by a tester or through automation. Both are fine and acceptable. But the detailed nature of scripted testing implies that they're designed really to confirm expected behavior. And this will discourage more in-depth exploration of risk areas. So for the maximum benefit and for optimum defect detection, you should actually use a combination of the different testing techniques. Consider all the options and do that upfront during your validation planning stage. So if we're talking about Adobe Acrobat Sign, the scripted test cases are made available to you as templates. We have these as a validation package that are distributed to Adobe's customer base. Customers can use these scripted test scripts, which is difficult to say, but if they can use them if they want as a starting point, they can adapt them. But in addition to those templates, there's also some records, because we use here at Montreal, we use those test scripts as a starting point for testing, and those executed test records are also made available to customers. So now you have the option to actually, if you prefer to do the testing on your own in your environment, you can use the test script templates that are made available to you, but you also have a copy of the test execution records available to you. And that's also something that you can consider doing. You can leverage those vendor supply documents as your own instead of doing the testing in your own environment. It's for you to decide what you're comfortable with, but the options are available for you, and follow your gut and your risk assessment to decide what options are preferred and beneficial to your validation strategy. Your validation project should always be carried out as a controlled process. It's important to act with intent. As the regulated user, you should document the procedures that you follow to ensure that the computerized systems are compliant and fit for intended use. Establish procedural controls to oversee how you perform your validation. Usually this means that your organization will have some kind of validation policy or validation master plan, which describes the main etiologies or your acceptable practices. So for example, does your organization follow a V-model approach to validation? Does your organization allow the use of scripted and unscripted testing? Does your organization accept the use of manual and automated testing? Do you allow for the assessment of your vendor's documentation and acceptance of vendor documentation instead of, as a way of reducing your burden? All of this, should be thought up front and worked into your validation policy or master plan. We've already talked about this, but you should also make sure that you implement appropriate technical controls to meet your intended use. Identify and implement the appropriate features that will allow you to ensure authenticity and integrity of the electronic records, and decide if you need additional controls to protect the confidentiality of your records, and also to ensure if, in the case of an electronic signature solution, the non-repudiation of those electronic signatures. Lastly, while we focus mainly on quality, because that is our goal, right? We want a system that works correctly. We can't escape from the fact that validation does remain a regulatory requirement. So make sure that you generate records of validation and maintain these records of validation, because they will be or may be requested during an inspection or audit. Your validation records can be traditional paper documents, but they don't need to be. Digital documents are fine. And if you have properly stored digital data, that's fine too. Information records that are stored in appropriate tools, that's acceptable. So if you're using tools like Jira or Azure DevOps, for example, to manage requirements, not a problem. You don't need to extract and prepare documentation just for the sake of having documentation. It's not the shape and form of the information that matters, it's the information itself. So as long as the information exists, is documented, can be reviewed and accepted, and is secured within the environment, then there's no need to just create documentation because that's what we used to do. So I want to emphasize that you need to be mindful that being validated doesn't equate with being compliant, right? Being compliant with regulations involves implementing both system level activities and organizational level activities. Validation is just one piece of the puzzle. If you want to be compliant, you're going to need to achieve this with governance. We touched on the system level activities because we already discussed about implementing technical controls, but to truly claim compliance and to be compliant with applicable regulations, standards, and your intended use, all that will require governance. This will entail organizational level activities, things beyond the system, things that are carried out under the guidance of your quality management system, and that will occur throughout the life cycle of the system. It involves making sure that you have established policies and procedures, that you make sure that the people involved are trained and qualified to do their work. You'll need to define data governance strategies, implement strategies for managing your suppliers. We already discussed validation planning. And finally, you'll also need to develop some activities for continual improvement. Let's take some time to look at all of these in more detail, starting with the policies and procedures. As the regulated user, you should establish your policies and procedures to make sure that your system is compliant and fit for intended use. When we speak of procedural controls, this broadly refers to policies, procedures, work practices, work instructions, really any process that is described and that can be followed to make sure that you have control and that there's consistency over how your systems are validated, used, and maintained. You'll need to establish procedural controls to oversee your validation planning activities, to describe, your commitment to validation, your organization's overall approach to validation. And as I mentioned earlier, that's usually in a validation policy or validation master plan. Procedural controls should exist to delineate the roles and responsibilities. And this will help you make sure that your people are accountable for the actions that they perform. People will need to be qualified to perform their assigned tasks. So you should establish training procedures. And this is meant to oversee how training is delivered and how training records are managed. You'll need to have procedures for supplier management, which can cover vendor selection or vendor assessments and other vendor onboarding activities. To make sure that the system is used properly, you should have procedures for system operation to ensure that the integrity of the data and the records that are generated through the system or maintained within the system, to make sure that all of that is honored. You should have policies for records management. And this should also touch upon how you manage backups and how you archive your data. Procedures should also be in place for how you manage security of your computerized systems. And this should also be extended to address user access management. And of course, your activities should always be risk-based, which means that you should have a risk management policy, or in the absence of a risk management policy, make sure that risk management is rolled into all the other procedures so that they touch on all the activities that you're carrying out. So we have seen that with younger organizations, which may not, are still emerging. They may not have a mature quality management system yet with all of these procedures, but these should strive to develop the procedural controls as soon as possible, with the expectation that the processes and procedures will evolve over time. That's normal. That's the normal course of continuous improvement. So let's speak about training. People are key to compliance, and they will contribute to the validated state of the system. So it's important that you, as the regulated user, ensure that the personnel who are involved in validation activities or who are involved in the use and management of the validated systems, that they have the appropriate experience and qualifications to perform their duties. That qualification can be obtained through appropriate training, through education, through on-the-job experience. Whatever it is, they need to make sure that they have the appropriate skill set to be able to perform their tasks. And in addition to that, you need to be able to demonstrate that. So it's important that records of training, such as training certificates, are maintained. Data integrity cannot be achieved without an understanding of the data flow through your system. So as a regulated user, it's important that you understand how the data is generated and where it resides. You should have a robust framework for consistent, accurate, and effective handling of your records and data, all the way to the end of the retention period. Don't forget to think about your exit strategy. If you decide to end your contract with a cloud service provider specifically, think about what you're going to do to repatriate your data or to migrate it into your replacement system. With an understanding of your data flow, you'll be able to identify risks to data integrity. And these risks can be introduced either at the level of technology, by the process, or by the way the people are running the process within the system. Once the risks are identified, you'll be able to identify and implement the controls that you need to manage those risks. And these controls can either be technical in nature or procedural in nature. So here are some examples of data integrity risks. From the technology point of view, you can understand that a component failure and something in the technology stack that is not working correctly, or even cybersecurity breaches, these can introduce risks to the data integrity. At the process level, we're talking about the process that the business process, but also the vendor activities. So deficiencies in the vendor activities can cause weakness in the delivery of the software service and the quality of that service. At the business process level, a poorly designed business process may also introduce risks. At the people level, we already talked about training. Lack of training, lack of awareness about issues like security, for example, those can be an issue. Human error and not knowing what to do is a source of risk. Different risk mitigation strategies can be adopted, and you should take some time to reflect on that and to identify what you can do to manage the risks. Some of the risk mitigation activities are things that you can do on your own. For example, at the security level, you can implement user access controls, periodically review user access privileges, and so forth. But when we're working with a cloud service provider, some of the risk mitigation strategies, those lie with the cloud service provider. And, you can think of like, what have they done to secure the infrastructure? Have they designed it with redundancy or other mechanisms to make sure that your system is available, your data is always available and accessible, and basically to withstand service disruptions? What about the SLA? Is there an SLA? And, has that been established and well understood? That SLA is an important piece of that relationship with your supplier. Establishing an SLA or other formal agreements, those are key, and they need to be emphasized even more when working with the cloud service provider, because when working in the cloud, responsibilities are shared. The cloud service provider will take care of things like managing the infrastructure or the platform, managing elements of security. They will apply regular upgrades and patches. But on the other side, you as the regulated user, you'll be responsible for managing configuration of your instance or of the application. You'll be responsible for managing the data that is processed through the system, and you'll probably be responsible for managing user access. So there's a balance there, and it's important to understand the shared responsibilities so that you can actually accomplish those responsibilities. And when working with the cloud service provider, it's important that they understand and acknowledge their responsibilities too. So that's why it's important. You may find that you will need to establish formal agreements, whether it's a contract, an SLA, or a quality agreement. Take time to figure out what needs to be formally agreed to in writing. You should also take some time to assess the competence and the reliability of your service provider. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to conduct a formal audit. There are different techniques for performing a vendor assessment, and it can be as simple as reviewing available documentation or reviewing the responses that your vendor provides to a self-assessment questionnaire. Sometimes you'll see with large corporations that it's challenging to get your vendor to accept your audit request or even to respond to a questionnaire. And, to be on their side, that's somewhat fair, right? Like they can't really entertain everyone's audit requests. It's kind of unruly to manage. And so, we can agree to disagree, but at the same time, we can also find alternate ways to carry out a due diligence. Things that you can do is just consider reviewing the availability of compliance certifications and third-party audit reports, which indicate that your supplier complies with specific industry standards. Beyond just checking that the certificate exists, you can actually even review the contents of those certifications and audit reports to gain better understanding of the vendor's processes, of their controls, and potentially even to discover problem areas. You may decide equally that the vendor and the software is just low risk and that a formal assessment is not warranted. And that's okay. If that's your choice, what you should do is at least document that choice, that decision to waive a vendor assessment, is acceptable. If it's a deliberate decision, just make sure that you document it and justify the rationale behind that choice. Documenting the outcome of the vendor assessment is recommended because this could be requested during an audit or an inspection. Now, along the way, people may change, your productivity tools may rotate, your priorities may shift. It's normal that people and processes will change over time. That's just evolution. So as a regulated user, you should work to monitor and review and improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of your processes that you've established. And really, it's just to make sure that you can identify where the strengths and weaknesses are. It may mean tracking compliance with SLAs, checking KPIs, just to have an indication or measurement of where the weaknesses are, and just continuously refine your processes to strive for improvement. In the end, by continually refining your procedures, what you'll find is that there's a reduced risk of non-compliance, and that's a good thing. So we've talked about, the initial validation and how you establish that and how do you establish the governance to achieve compliance. But then what? How do you keep it going and how do you stay compliant? The validated state must be maintained over time. And the way to do that is by making sure you have effective change control mechanisms. Failure to implement appropriate change control may result in the risk of non-compliance with policies, standards, and regulations. So change control is the process that will ensure that your changes are assessed to determine if there is any impact. You should make sure that your process allows you to assess those changes. And unfortunately, I guess, it may lead to additional work. You may find through your assessment that you'll need to do additional activities such as testing, updating systems documentation, or updating procedures, or even augmenting training for users, training and informing the users on the changes that are occurring. Where it gets tricky and where it's challenging is when we're working in the cloud. And that's because changes to a cloud-based service can be triggered by a user request or by the cloud service provider's release schedule. And that's where many of us feel like we hit a brick wall. When we're working with a cloud service provider, their decision to make an upgrade may affect us. Sometimes the changes are transparent and they don't have an effect, but sometimes it will compromise the validated state of your system. There's a risk that you may miss the upgrade. If you're not, on top of it, and if your vendor is not adequately communicating the changes, if they're not exposing sufficient details related to the release or to their roadmap, you may not even realize that there was a change until it's too late and the upgrade already happened. You'll need to implement processes to monitor the release information distributed by the vendor. If it's possible, subscribe to receive regular notifications from them. Of course, that's assuming that the vendor even makes the release information available and that the notifications are being pushed forward. So that comes back to the vendor management activities, asking them if they do actually expose their release information. That's something that should be looked into and investigated and guaranteed early on during the vendor selection and vendor assessment activities. Often we see that vendors release new features behind feature flags, which are, configuration settings if you want. And this will give the user more control when the feature is activated with their instance, or to give them control to opt out of an update. So behind a feature flag, until you deliberately turn on the feature in your environment, it means that there will be no effect from the release, which will essentially give the user more control, regain control over the release process. So that's something also to inquire when you're choosing a solution. How much control over the feature releases does the vendor allow you to have? So as promised, we said that we would be using Adobe Acrobat Sign as a case study. And so that's where I'm going now. I want to just use Adobe Acrobat Sign to illustrate all of these concepts of validation and governance, starting with the actual web application. Acrobat Sign is a web-based electronic signature solution. From an end user's perspective, it's a very simple system, right? You sit at your desk, you log into a web application, you upload a document, and you request signatures. The invited recipients are going to receive a notification by email, and following some on-screen prompts, they'll be able to apply their electronic or digital signature with just a simple, few keystrokes. In the end, you'll end up with a signed electronic record. But as a computerized system, it's much more complicated than that. Behind that web application is Adobe, the cloud service provider, and its partners and sub-service providers. Adobe uses both AWS and Azure services to host the different environments that it manages. Both AWS and Azure, Microsoft Azure, adhere to industry standards and are ISO and SOC compliant. Adobe itself adheres to industry standards and holds ISO certifications and is SOC 2 compliant. Adobe exercises best practices when it comes to security, maintenance, and compliance. And this is to ensure that the service that it offers is maintained in a secure and controlled state. Adobe is continuously monitoring the service for the prevention and detection of security vulnerabilities and incidents. They have an incident response program. Each security vulnerability is investigated, the incidents are investigated, and they're mitigated by the incident response team. They do follow a software development lifecycle process, which is structured, and it incorporates rigorous quality testing steps. The release management process is controlled. They plan their software updates, they schedule them, and they communicate their schedule through the publication of pre-release notes, which are published in advance of the release. They publish release notes on the day of the actual production launch, and they also have technical notifications, which publish a longer-term roadmap or vision of the platform. Adobe collaborates with Montrium. We work with them throughout the year to complement their software lifecycle activities. We produce validation document templates, and we produce evidence of testing, which we complete in the sandbox environment. Our test results are published, and they're accessible to customers. So I already touched on this earlier. These are available for you to download and leverage if you think that they are suitable to complement your validation strategy. Now, all of the work that Adobe does, that's accomplished by a large pool of resources that work in software quality, in DevOps, in support, in compliance. They have a very large team of competent personnel, and Adobe also has policies in place to make sure that their personnel complete security awareness training on a regular basis and other training related to their job functions. As I said, from an end user's perspective, it seems like a very simple system, but as you can see behind the scenes, behind that login screen, there's a very well-oiled machine that keeps the system running. And I know this partly because of our working relationship with Adobe, but also because all of this information that I just described is actually disclosed on Adobe's Trust Center. Adobe has a compliance team that works really hard to publish white papers and to expose all of the relevant compliance certifications and audit reports. All of that information is available on Adobe's Trust Center. It's full of content that goes a really long way in supporting the customers through their vendor selection and vendor qualification activities. And I fully encourage you to take a look at that because that is probably the best strategy for doing your vendor assessment of Adobe. Doing an audit of Adobe is on site, knocking on their door is probably an unreasonable expectation. And that really leads me to the next piece, which is the governance piece. If you're considering using Adobe Acrobat Sign, or if you're already using Acrobat Sign as your preferred solution for Part 11 compliance signatures, I'm going to remind you that the responsibility for compliance is yours. But you can see that so much is happening under the control of Adobe, and you shouldn't turn a blind eye to that. You want to make sure that what Adobe does is robust, because what they do and perhaps what they don't do could affect the availability, security, and quality of the service and the overall state of compliance. So a good place to start with your compliance journey is the vendor assessment. You should perform a due diligence to ensure that you're comfortable with your choice of Adobe as a competent and reliable service provider. We recommend using all of that collateral that I mentioned on the Trust Center as your basis for the assessment. There's no real need to go conduct an on-site audit. And quite frankly, as I said, it's probably unrealistic that an on-site audit will occur. In addition to all the collateral on the Trust Center, you should also know that Adobe does have a service level agreement available on their website. The Adobe service commitments describe their service availability, and it describes the uptime thresholds and Adobe's liability for failure to achieve the minimum uptime percentages. So take a look at that and maybe even have a copy available on hand. When you're comfortable moving forward with Adobe and you're ready to begin your validation project, think about the appropriate risk-based validation strategy. For Adobe Acrobat Sign, remember that, Montreal, through our collaboration with Adobe, we do make test execution results available, and we do make those available as part of a validation template package. And so take a look at that package, including the test results. If there is overlap between the material that is provided to you with your intended use cases, absolutely feel free to leverage them. That's why they're being provided to the customers. It's not necessary to duplicate the testing efforts. Maybe you'll choose to only leverage a portion of the package, not the whole entire package. If that's what you decide is suitable, that's fine. So even just working with a little piece of it and augmenting it with additional work, additional user acceptance testing by your users, that's a strategy that is something that you can come up with to make your validation project easier. Make sure you establish proper governance with the necessary policies and procedures, and make sure your people are trained on them. Make sure you also figure out a proper data governance plan. The documents that you sign through Adobe Acrobat Sign will reside on the service for as long as you are an active customer, you have an active contract with Adobe. But do you really want those signed records to live on Adobe servers? Adobe is an electronic signature service. It's not meant to be used as a system of record. So consider what you need to do to retrieve those signed records and bring them back in-house. How will you take them out of Adobe, copy them out of Adobe, and bring them into your own document management system or quality management system? That's a strategy that you'll have to come up with based on your requirements and needs and retention plans. Figure out also how to manage changes, right? What is your workflow for change management? You may find that you want to define different procedures for configuration changes that are triggered by user requests versus changes that are pushed out from Adobe. So when it comes to reviewing the Adobe changes, assign someone who understands how your instance of Acrobat Sign has been implemented, and make them responsible for monitoring the release notes, the pre-release notes, and the release schedule. This person or persons should be able to review the pre-release notes to assess or catch if there's anything in there that is expected to impact your validated state, and then just flag that so that you can react appropriately. Some changes may lead to you having to update operating procedures, specifications, or even system configuration settings. So if there are any changes of that nature that will impact your validated state, you'll need to have some mechanism to make sure that they're captured and documented in a change control. When it comes to major releases for Adobe Acrobat Sign, there is a change impact assessment that is prepared, and that can be downloaded with that validation package that Montream and Adobe make available. The assessment is based on a standard configuration for Adobe Acrobat Sign for Part 11 compliance signatures. So if your instance of Acrobat Sign is configured to align with that benchmark configuration, then you're in a great position to be able to use that impact assessment and adopt it as your own. If your instance of Acrobat Sign isn't 100% configured to match that benchmark configuration, you may still be able to use that documented change impact assessment that is available to you, or at least pieces of it, and then just really focus beyond that on the differences between your environment and the benchmark configuration, because that will allow you to really focus on just the differences, on the delta, without having to do a full revalidation of the entire system. I do want to mention that you can subscribe to be notified when that changed impact assessment and when a new version of the validation package becomes available. If you subscribe or register to receive the notifications, Montream will send an email to anyone who has registered, and we will do that for all the major releases of Adobe Acrobat Sign. Lastly, as part of your governance strategy, think about your contingency plan. What happens in the worst case possible if all the pieces fall apart and everything breaks down and your system becomes available? What will you do if Adobe Acrobat Sign is no longer available to you? Do you have procedures that will allow you to go to your plan B? And that may just be reverting back to pen and paper. But that has to be part of your business continuity plan. Make sure you have thought that through and you have a contingency plan in place. So here we are wrapping up. If you're finding that all of this is overwhelming, which it can be, I'm going to let you know that Montream is here to support you through that if you choose to work with Montream. And I'll hand it over to Danny, as he will be able to describe to you our continuous validation service, where we're there to help you through the validation process.
Thanks, Jonna. And I honestly, great webinar. I know, given the conversations we usually have, I'm sure there's plenty of people in the audience that are very grateful for all the information and definitely a little overwhelmed, but have no fear. As you guys may have heard us allude to today, but Montream is the partner with Adobe when it comes to Part 11 validation for Adobe. So we have a continuous validation service here in-house where we would come in and perform the validation with you and maintain the validated state. Now, I don't want to turn this into a sales pitch for all of you guys, so we've given you the tools in front of you in order to book us for a consultation. If you guys have any questions that don't get answered today, or if there's questions about what we can do in terms of supporting you for the system, or if you have any questions about asking about the free pack, you can book a free consultation for us up on the top right of your screen. If you click that button, it should bring you to a link to our calendars. There's also a QR code located on the slide right now before you that'll bring you to our calendars. And you will also be getting in the follow-up email from me with the instructions on how to download the webinar today. You will also have a link in case you want to contact us. Now, that being said, I do want to make sure everyone is aware of the major update that is happening to Adobe on April 22nd. They are phasing out the classic version of Adobe right now. So anybody who is currently operating on the classic version and not the new version, there will be some remediation activity that you guys will need to do in terms of maintaining your compliance. If you want to learn more about that, feel free to contact us. We're more than happy to explain. I see that there's some questions about the Adobe release schedule. And as Jonna said, we provide the free pack for the major releases for the majority of the time. The minor releases usually are not that much of a validation, effect validation that much. But I'll give it back over to Jonna for our takeaway and wrap up, and then we'll get into the QA session while we have a quick 5 minutes left.
Well, the takeaway from the session, what I really want to emphasize is that the regulated user, the organization using the system, is responsible for validation and for compliance. And as such, it's the regulated user who has to demonstrate with objective evidence that the system is fit for their intended use, meaning the system can provide the capabilities to fulfill their requirements. The regulated user should ensure that they have selected a cloud vendor who is suitable and has appropriate processes in place to fulfill their responsibilities. The regulated user should implement policies and procedures to ensure the system is operated and maintained in a controlled manner. And the regulated user has to maintain the validated state. And this is effective change control mechanisms. So in a nutshell, those were the concepts that I wanted to communicate. And I hope you found that valuable.
I'm sure there are plenty of people that did. Thank you, Jana. So let's move over to the Q&A session. I know we got quite a bit of questions today, but I will start us off with one right now. So yeah, here we go. Is it necessary to complete a validation after the initial validation if the release notes in that package have no changes that are affected by 21 CFR Part 11?
So the initial validation is going to establish, a baseline, and then from there, what you want to do is a risk-based approach to decide if anything is changing what has already been put into a state of control. So if your release notes, the activity that needs to be performed is reviewing those release notes to assess whether the changes are touching upon any functionality that you're either using or that is necessary for Part 11 compliance. So through that assessment, if you review the release notes and you find that there is no impact on the intended use or on the regulatory compliance, then you can just justify that, saying there is no impact. And if that's the outcome of your assessment, that you've determined there is no impact on your intended use, then it's status quo. Just keep going on using the system and maintaining that validated state as such. It's only when you assess that there is a potential impact that will change how you're using the system, how your intended use is being met. That's where you need to focus in and come up with the remediation activities. Like, what do you need to do? Do you need to repeat some testing? Do you need to train your users? Do you need to update SOPs? To do a full revalidation, that's unlikely that will happen, because if you're following a risk-based approach, you'll probably want to pare it down through just regression testing on critical areas. Mm-hmm. But if you're not anticipating any impact, then that's what the risk-based approach is for, right? Just say we do not anticipate any impact and anything that is going to affect how we're using the system, so we don't need to do any additional revalidation activities.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jana. And so here is our next one. Adobe Acrobat Sign shows more releases than what is being supplied in the Montreal validation packages. Where can I find which releases are included in the Montreal packages? An example, Montreal's validation package released in March, September, November, and then the Sign packages that were released, the minor releases versus the major releases. Basically, John, I know you know this one already.
Yeah. So again, I'm going to come back to the definition of validation, which is to show that your system is fit for intended use. I explained that you verbalize that intended use through your requirements. And so when Adobe makes a major release, they scope their releases so that major releases is when they will introduce new functionality, add new features, or change the functionality of features. So from your point of view, your intended use could be affected when there is new features, new functionality, or changes to functionality, because it's functionality what that will allow you to demonstrate or accomplish your intended use. So that's why we're focusing on Adobe's major releases only. Minor releases are not meant to introduce any functionality or to change the existing features. They're really there just to patch and fix things that were meant to exist already. And so from that point of view, that will not affect your ability to meet your intended use. And so through that analysis, that's why we discredit the minor releases,
Mhm.
and we'll focus our impact assessments on the major releases only.
Perfect. Well, guys, we're just coming up on time, so I apologize if we didn't get to some of your questions today. But that being said, Jana and I are more than happy to always hop on a call or answer any emails of any questions that didn't get answered today. Please feel free to reach out to us directly. You can use or book us directly using the meeting. So thank you so much, guys. Really appreciate it. Thank you for attending. I will keep you updated on when this is available for all of you guys. And don't forget to download the documents if you want the PowerPoint in the on the right side there. So thank you so much, everybody. And Jana, thank you. Big thank you. That was a wonderful presentation.
You're welcome.
All righty, bye, guys. Have a wonderful day.